What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Vergil Ortiz Jr. 17 wins, 0 losses. All 17 wins, by the way, coming via knockout or stoppage, taking on Egidijus Kavaliauskas, aka Mean Machine. 22 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw. This fight is taking place on August 14th at the Ford Center in Frisco, Texas. That's pretty much close to the hometown of Vergil Ortiz Jr. Now, I was really excited when this fight was announced. Of course, there are better welterweights that you would want to see somebody, a prospect, the caliber of Vergil Ortiz Jr. You know, there's some people that you would rather see him take on than Mean Machine, but Mean Machine is pretty much the next logical step up, quality-wise, an opponent for Vergil Ortiz Jr., who, you know, since turning pro has just been surging like a maniac. 17 wins, all via knockout, and just recently he's gradually started, you know, kind of having those step-up types of opportunities. So he first landed on a lot of people's radar when he demolished Mauricio Herrera in the 3rd round, knocked him out in the 3rd. Mauricio Herrera had his biggest moment in a fight that he should have won via decision against Danny Garcia, but Danny Garcia was awarded the decision. Mauricio Herrera has since pretty much faded and declined, and by the time he fought Vergil Ortiz in 2019, he was pretty much a shell of himself, and Vergil Ortiz Jr. really made him pay for it. So since then, Vergil Ortiz has knocked out Antonio Orozco, former highly touted prospect Brad Solomon, Samuel Vargas, who we just saw get destroyed by Conor Benn, whose fight was recently canceled due to COVID. But yeah, Vergil Ortiz Jr. was basically just beating the hell out of Samuel Vargas for about 7 rounds, stopped him in the 7th round, and then most recently, Vergil Ortiz Jr. took on Maurice Hooker, former champion down at 140. He lost a unification title fight against Jose Ramirez, who's Vergil Ortiz Jr.'s training partner. They both train under Robert Garcia, one of the greatest trainers in the game over the past 10 or so years. And I looked at Vergil Ortiz Jr. as being a slightly more sophisticated and more powerful fighter, but in a somewhat similar style as Jose Ramirez. There are differences, but when Maurice Hooker fought Jose Ramirez, he got stopped like in the 5th round. And then, you know, he goes up in weight and has this showdown versus Vergil Ortiz Jr. where, you know, Hooker had his moments against Ortiz. He stung him with a couple, you know, long-range power shots. Ortiz wore him pretty well. My hunch was that in fighting Maurice Hooker, it was pretty much a matter of time. I thought that Hooker was going to be competitive while it lasted, but I don't know. When you look at Hooker versus first Jose Ramirez and then against Vergil Ortiz Jr., you see him in these shootouts where he's not really using his range as effectively as you think he could. And then when he gets caught up in these, you know, long periods of devastating exchanges, I don't know. I just feel like chin and body-wise, it's like Maurice Hooker isn't truly built to code to withstand the storms, and then he eventually wilts. And that appeared to be the case against Vergil Ortiz Jr. Hooker was stopped in the 7th round. And he did hurt his arm in that fight, but, you know, he had gotten dropped before that, and you could tell Vergil Ortiz Jr. was starting to kick it into high gear, really starting to pour it on with some devastating power punches. He's one of the more vicious punchers in the game. It just so happens that he couples that with some very sophisticated skill that makes him a very, very scary prospect. And basically a handful for anybody who's going to be fighting him going forward at 147 or inevitably at 154 at some point. He's a very patient fighter. He's got a wonderful jab. That might be his best punch. And I was really curious to see what that battle of jabs was going to look like between Ortiz and Hooker. And it was everything I expected. Very competitive. They both throw a power jab. It's just that Ortiz, he changes levels and throws these feints, and then he'll, you know, keep the jab out consistently, but he's looking for opportunities to blast you to the body and then to throw, you know, 3 to 4 punch combinations at some point, or he's sure to pretty much pressure you into the ropes or into the corner, and that's when he really starts to wreak havoc. And so Ortiz Jr. is now fighting Mean Machine, who I think because of his performance, he being Kavaliauskas, Mean Machine's performance against Terence Crawford, he's kind of built this reputation that I think kind of exceeds what I've seen from him performance-wise. Mean Machine is now 33 years old compared to Vergil Ortiz Jr. being 23 years old. Mean Machine, beautiful amateur career. I mean, he's a former world champion. In like 2011, he won the world championships at welterweight. Extremely credentialed amateur. And so since turning pro, you know, he won his first like dozen, then 13, 14. He basically won his first 18 fights and then started having to step up in class. And then he fights David Avanesian. David Avanesian beat Shane Mosley, a very old Shane Mosley, in basically Shane Mosley's final fight. David Avanesian is a former, belt holder at 147. Yes, it was a lesser belt, one of those regular titles, not one of the major four, but he was a lesser WBA title holder. And then he, lost the fight to Lamont Peterson via decision. I mean, Peterson was really putting it on him throughout the fight, but Avanesian persevered and made it the distance. Fast forward to just like this past February, this year, we just saw David Avanesian upset a highly touted British fighter named Josh Kelly. Was looking super talented, kind of, has an athletic style of fighting where it's a little bit flashy, and he kind of does that pseudo Floyd Mayweather stance a little bit. Well, David Avanesian was having none of it, and he basically penetrated Josh Kelly's guard and really just roughed him up. There were a couple head clashes, but yeah, Kelly started bleeding from like multiple places, eventually got stopped in the 6th round. Huge win for Avanesian. But, a couple years before that, he fights Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. This is in February of 2018. And this is a pretty competitive fight. There are a lot of exchanges. Neither one of these guys was exhibiting a ton of defense, but Kavaliauskas ends up proving to be the harder puncher between he and Avanesian, stops him in the 6th round. Big win for Mean Machine Kavaliauskas in stopping David Avanesian. So after that big win, he fights Juan Carlos Abreu, Roberto Arriaza, beats them both via unanimous decision and 3rd round knockout. And then he fights Ray Robinson, which is supposed to be the fight that if he does well in that one, he's supposed to get a Terence Crawford fight. It's supposed to carry a lot of momentum and build his name further in fighting Ray Robinson, who, I mean, let's be honest, he has been the unfortunate recipient of some bad judging. I mean, most recently, he should have been the guy to beat Josh Kelly, but they called that one a majority draw. I thought that Ray Robinson, a slick southpaw, should have won that against Josh Kelly. A few fights before that, he beat Breedis Prescott, who famously knocked out Amir Khan several years ago and fought a pretty competitive fight with Terence Crawford back at 135. And after beating Prescott in 2017, Ray Robinson loses via TKO to Yordenis Ugas, who currently holds the WBA title at welterweight. And then he fights Kavaliauskas. And, again, Kavaliauskas was the one bringing the momentum in here. He was supposed to be the one to do well. Well, he didn't fare too well, in my opinion, against the slick southpaw Ray Robinson. And Ray Robinson, again, instead of being rewarded with a decision win, which I thought he deserved, he was granted, I'll say granted, even though it was a majority draw, luck of the draw for Kavaliauskas. I thought that Kavaliauskas should have had a decision loss against Ray Robinson, but they called it a draw. Kavaliauskas, Mean Machine, gets to fight Terence Crawford next anyway, and that's where he, to many people, kind of overachieved against Terence Crawford. He should have been rewarded a knockdown in that fight, but he, really only won 2 rounds in that fight. So I think there's a little bit of revisionist history in Terence Crawford versus Kavaliauskas. Yes, Kavaliauskas, did arguably win multiple rounds, but, it was Terence Crawford winning the vast majority of the rounds, like 6 out of the first 8 before stopping Kavaliauskas in the 9th round. So he did buzz Terence Crawford and kind of rocked him a bit. And then Terence Crawford kind of bit down and, really fought a defensively irresponsible fight against Mean Machine. And that's just the type of fight that Mean Machine wants to fight. Mean Machine likes to get in the pocket and basically trade 3-4 punch combinations. He's got a really hard right hand, and he likes to let the other guy make the first move. Like if the guy throws a jab, then he'll just start throwing a 2-3 punch combination. Mean Machine likes to kind of sit back and then let his hands go. Sit back and then let his hands go. And again, watch out for his strong right hand. So he did rock Terence Crawford a couple times. But again, Terence Crawford was controlling the vast majority of that fight, and he got that 9th round TKO. But again, Terence Crawford, in my opinion, could have fought Kavaliauskas in the same way that Ray Robinson fought Kavaliauskas. Could have played it safe and won a commanding decision. But instead, he decided to pretty much play Mean Machine's game and paid for it a couple times, but eventually got the knockout. So in Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. And yes, Kavaliauskas had one fight after that Crawford fight. We will call it his COVID fight. It was September of 2020, and he stopped Michael Zuski in the 8th round. Another TKO win for the, again, hard-hitting Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. But I'm looking at Ortiz versus Kavaliauskas, and I think that Ortiz's jab is going to give Mean Machine a ton of problems. He's got, again, this is like a power punch of a jab. And, Vergil Ortiz Jr. is very defensively responsible. So I don't think that he's just going to oblige in a total all-out firefight with Mean Machine, even if that's what Mean Machine wants. Not that Mean Machine is just a brawler. He's not. But comparatively, I think that Vergil Ortiz has the better skill set, the more crafty skill set overall, especially defensively. So I think that it's going to be Ortiz who's winning the rounds. For as long as the fight goes, he's going to be winning majority of the rounds behind a jab, but I also don't think that Mean Machine's going to be able to escape the inevitable onslaught of power punches, especially to the body from Vergil Ortiz Jr. So I look at 1, the jab, and then 2, the left hook to the body as being the 2 punches that separate Vergil Ortiz Jr. from Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. And, Vergil Ortiz Jr. has been looking so money since he's been on the map that it's almost inevitable that a guy has an off night. Every fighter has an off night where they're just not their self. Grab a Snickers, right? But I don't think it's going to be this fight for Ortiz Jr. where he underperforms. I actually think that Mean Machine's style is going to be an interesting challenge for Ortiz. There are going to be some things to, account for, like that devastating right hand from Mean Machine. So Ortiz is going to have to be careful. But again, I think that having the slight height advantage is 5'10 versus 5'9, and having a 1-inch reach advantage, 72 inches versus 71, nearly negligible, but a slight difference. Plus, just having a greater commitment to the jab. I think that Ortiz is going to be able to kind of sweet science Mean Machine on his way to winning an eventual stoppage, because I do think that at a certain point, Kavaliauskas will wilt to the devastating power punching combinations of Ortiz Jr. Yes, it took Ortiz Jr. 7 rounds to get Samuel Vargas out of there, but I think that, yes, on paper, this might be his greatest challenge. Maurice Hooker is a former champion, so you could argue that that is his best opponent to date. But I think that when you factor in the division, the weight class that they're competing in, I just don't know where Maurice Hooker is at 147, whereas we have an idea, at least, of where Mean Machine Kavaliauskas is. But I think that the enigma, the very interesting personality, you check Vergil Ortiz Jr. out in his interviews. I mean, the guy likes to, play guitar. He's super introspective. He just seems to be a thinker's thinker. And that makes me wonder how long his fight career is, because, I mean, being a cerebral dude, you just wonder how much of an appetite you'll continue to have for this blood and guts sport that is boxing. So keep your eye on that. But as long as he is fully committed, Vergil Ortiz Jr. is going to be a pretty wicked opponent for anybody. And I don't think that this fight against Mean Machine is going to be the exception. So I actually think that this train keeps rolling for Vergil Ortiz Jr. and this knockout streak that he's on. Never having gone the distance, the furthest he's gone is the 7th round. I think that the knockout streak continues here. I think he stops Kavaliauskas in the middle to late rounds. I mean, damn. So the question then is, if Vergil Ortiz does end up stopping or even winning against Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, where do you go if you're Ortiz Jr.? Because at the end of the day, he is fighting on the zone under Golden Boy Promotions. And let's be honest, it is slim pickings for anybody that's not PBC at welterweight. They're holding like 90% of the elite talent there. So, you know, Top Rank has Terence Crawford, and that looks like the opponent that this might set up for. So even if Ortiz beats Kavaliauskas, it will require cross-promotional efforts between Golden Boy and the platform of DAZN, and then, you know, Top Rank, Bob Arum, ESPN to work that potential Terence Crawford versus Vergil Ortiz Jr. showdown out with. But, you know, aside from Crawford possibly making that match, I don't know what else you do with Ortiz if you're Golden Boy DAZN, because it seems to be so tough to do 147 cross-promotional business with PBC because they don't need to do business with anybody. I mean, except for Manny Pacquiao, and they got that business done for Errol Spence. But aside from that, you know, Vergil Ortiz Jr. doesn't call shots like Pacquiao calls shots. He's Vergil Ortiz Jr., not Manny Pacquiao. So, unfortunately, I just don't see the path forward for Vergil Ortiz Jr. to have an elite 147-pound opponent in the foreseeable future. Not, you know, Keith Thurman, not Sean Porter, anybody like that. And, you know, not Mikey Garcia, because they are both trained by Robert Garcia, Mikey Garcia's older brother. So I don't see that happening. So yeah, let me know what you think. First about Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, and what is the path forward for the winner of this fight, particularly Vergil Ortiz Jr., because he is the A-side fighter, and I do believe that he's going to get the win over Mean Machine. What is the path forward for Vergil Ortiz Jr. being on DAZN and represented by Golden Boy? Please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.